For most of human history, nobody had a home. Not because they were poor or unlucky, because they didn't need one. A band of hunter-gatherers moved constantly, following animals, following seasons, following food. Everything they owned had to be carried. A shelter was something you built in an afternoon and abandoned in a week. The idea of a permanent structure, a place you'd return to, a place that was yours, simply didn't exist. There was no here. There was only where we are right now. That changed the moment someone stored grain. When early farming communities started harvesting wheat and barley, they had a problem that nomads never had to deal with. A successful harvest produces far more food than you can eat in a day, or a week. So you store it, you dig pits, you weave baskets, you build clay containers. And suddenly, for the first time in human history, you have something that cannot move with you. You can't carry a season's worth of grain across a landscape. It's too heavy, and more importantly, you can't afford to leave it behind. That grain is the difference between eating through winter and starving, so you stay. This sounds simple, it wasn't. Staying in one place created a problem that nomads never faced, other people who wanted what you had. A wandering band with a few days' worth of food isn't worth raiding. There's nothing to take that you couldn't find yourself, but a settlement sitting on months of stored grain, that's worth the trip. So the people who stayed had to guard what they'd built, and guarding something requires being present, constantly. Which means you build something more permanent than a lean-to. You build walls. You build a roof that lasts more than a season. You build something you can defend. The earliest permanent structures archaeologists have found line up almost exactly with the earliest evidence of grain storage. At a site called Ohalo II in northern Israel, dating back around 23,000 years, researchers found the remains of brush huts alongside wild cereal grains that had been gathered and stored. It's one of the earliest hints of sedentism, people choosing to stay put, and it's tied directly to stored plant food. Around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, you start seeing something unmistakable. Villages, mud brick structures with multiple rooms, shared walls between houses, streets in the loosest sense of the word. Communities of dozens, then hundreds of people, all anchored to the same patch of land. None of this was planned. Nobody sat down and decided to invent the village. It followed logically, step by step, from one simple fact: the grain can't leave, so neither can we. And once you're staying, everything changes. A nomadic group has no reason to invest in the land. You're leaving anyway. But a farming family that's staying for decades starts to think differently. You clear more rocks. You dig better irrigation. You improve the soil. You plant fruit trees that won't bear fruit for years because you'll still be here when they do. You start thinking about the future in a way that nomads simply didn't need to. The structure you live in reflects this. Early farming homes weren't just shelters, they were investments. Mud brick takes labor to make and time to dry. A thatched roof needs to be maintained. A grain storage pit needs to be sealed properly, or you lose everything to moisture and rot. The house becomes a project, something you improve over time, something you pass on. And here is where something genuinely new enters human life: inheritance. A nomad doesn't leave behind property. What would they leave? Their knowledge, maybe. Their tools, but a farming family leaves behind a house, land, grain stores, and livestock. For the first time, where you were born matters. The family you were born into determines what you start with. Wealth becomes something that accumulates across generations, not just within a single life. This is also where the concept of home as an emotional idea begins to take shape. When you've invested years of labor into a place, when your storage pits are full, when your fruit trees are finally bearing, when your children were born in that same room, leaving isn't just inconvenient. It's loss. The attachment to place that feels so natural to us, the idea that somewhere specific is yours, that you belong there, that it can be taken from you, none of that existed for most of human history. It's a byproduct of grain storage. There's a detail from the archaeological record that captures this shift perfectly. At a Neolithic site in Turkey called Catalhoyuk, dating to around 9,000 years ago, researchers found that the dead were buried under the floors of houses, not in separate cemeteries, under the floors where the family lived and slept. The ancestors were literally built into the structure. The house wasn't just where you lived, it was where your people had always lived. It was the family itself, made out of mud and brick. Nomads don't need houses, but once you have a harvest worth protecting, you need walls. Once you have walls, you need to stay. Once you stay long enough, the place stops being just a location. It becomes something you'd fight for, something you'd die for, something you'd bury your parents beneath and raise your children above. That's what grain storage created, not just architecture, the first sense of home.